Welcome back, everybody. My voice is still recovering. Last week, right after I posted that video about the T-bows, I got sick. Now I've largely recovered, but my voice is it still sounds off. So I hope you don't mind. I really want to record this video today because this weekend is going to be crazy. Next week, I might not have time. And this is an important book. Before getting to other things, posting anything else, I'd like to post something about this short and sweet book, Why Philosophize, by Jean-François Lyotard. Lyotard is primarily known, people who have heard about him but are not familiar with him in a more in-depth way. We usually know him through his Postmodern Condition, The Postmodern Condition, A Report on Knowledge, which was commissioned by the Quebec University Council. But people who are more familiar with him, scholars who have done work on Lyotard, they always say that the postmodern condition is not a representative sample of his contribution to philosophy, literary theory, art theory. So if you're interested in his work, his broader contribution, if you like to get a representation of what he did, what he was about, I have here the guide and reader, the Lyotard Reader and Guide, put together by Keith Crome and James Williams. And this book, which was published by Columbia University Press, has collected a sample of Lyotard's writing divided into 4 different sections, 4 different parts. The first part is philosophy, second is literature, and then politics, and finally art. And I would recommend this, even if it is just for that first 30 pages or so of introduction by Crome and Williams. James Williams also has a book called Understanding Poststructuralism. And in that book, 1 chapter is devoted to Lyotard, which is a great chapter. That book is really great. If you like to get an introduction to Lyotard within the context of other post-structuralist thinkers, that would be a good place, a good book to read. James Williams also has a whole book, an introduction to Jean-François Lyotard. It's one of those introduction to key thinkers, polity. This book that I'm talking about today was also published by Polity. Why Philosophize? This book was translated to English by Andrew Brown, published by Polity in 2013, with an introduction by Corinne Enaudeau. Corinne Enaudeau, who I believe is Jean-François Lyotard's daughter, if I'm not mistaken. It's based on a series of 4 lectures delivered at Sorbonne in 1964. But even the French edition of the book wasn't published until 2012. So I think it's a reworking of those 4 lecture notes, because the book reads like a book, more so than a series of lectures. I really enjoyed reading this book, and I was really happy to read it slowly over a span of 4 weeks with my reading group. We had 4 separate discussions, each discussion for one of the 4 lectures. And if you at some point, by the way, decide to join our reading group, you will have access to those 4 recordings, along with all the rest of the Patreon archive. In this book, Lyotard gives us a really lively, really poetic, energetic treatment, an introduction to the task of philosophy according to his perspective, to the life of philosophy. The text is not super easy. It needs a bit of patience, especially for readers who are not familiar with concepts like dialectical reason, or more generally the style of continental philosophy. You also need patience to see how the 4 lectures are interconnected, despite the fact that they seem to be about separate subtopics. Like lecture 1 is about desire and philosophy. Lecture 2 is about origin of philosophy, the origin of philosophical attitude or attitudes. The third lecture is about language of philosophy or philosophical speech. And the fourth last lecture is about the connection between philosophy and social political action, social political transformation, with reference to that thesis 11 on Feuerbach, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach by Karl Marx. If you stay with the 4 lectures, you will see that, especially in lecture 4, that Lyotard's treatment of these 4 subtopics are really trying to describe one single big picture. It's like Lyotard's grand narrative. He's in the postmodern condition, he says there is no grand narrative, but in this in these 4 lectures, he's giving us a narrative. Maybe it's not grand, but there's several connecting threads, or the threads are connected to each other. So, as I said, I'm going to read a few passages for you and add my comments occasionally. I'm reading from page 18. Quote, when we ask ourselves not what is philosophy, but why philosophize, we are emphasizing how discontinuous with itself philosophy is, how it is possible for philosophy to be absent. End quote. So he's talking about how philosophy could become absent to itself. Think, for example, of the life of a philosopher across time. The philosopher as a young person, as a student, when he or she or they enter school as a first-year undergraduate student for the first time, and then imagine them later as a master's student, as a doctoral student, as a young professor, as the older professor, and then a retired professor. At all these points in time, they have, presumably, if they still have philosophical interests, their interests and what they care about isn't fixed, cannot be fixed. It has to be adaptable and adjust itself to what they learn, the interlocutors that they engage, what they respond to. Even if they remain interested in the same philosophical question, there are inevitably adjustments. There are certain things that they lose touch with. There are certain things that they have to find again. Lyotard is pointing out that a philosopher needs to continuously find their connection to philosophy, to find the way in which philosophy remains present, because it becomes absent. The philosopher continuously loses touch with that exact desire that fueled their engagement with philosophy. The need to begin again. And this is the point that to continue philosophy, it needs to begin again. The beginning again is the way to continue for philosophy, in Lyotard's terms. Because the philosophical situation at the same time consists of presence and absence of philosophy. From page 19, quote, to grasp this potential relationship between the act of philosophizing and the presence-absence structure, it will be useful to examine what desire is, end quote. From the next page, page 20, quote, that which desires has what it lacks. Or we can read, that which desires has in some sense what it lacks, without which it would not desire it, and yet it does not have it, end quote. So think an analogy here. It might be a silly analogy, but I think it applies. Imagine the experience of a person in love. Being in love means you have your beloved. You have a knowledge. You know, without knowing your beloved, you can't love them. But you don't really have the beloved. So there's something that you have, but it's also something you don't have. Even if you, in the ordinary sense of the word, have the beloved, you're still confronting things like mortality and other limits, and the limits of understanding, limits of shared understanding. And those things sustain and frame desire. Lyotard talks about the scene from Plato's Symposium involving Socrates and Alcibiades. Alcibiades being the young man, to describe the different modes of desire. On the one hand, we have the desire of a young person, an ambitious person, when desire is combined with ambition. The ambition partly to seduce this older, wiser person. On the other hand, we have the desire of Socrates combined with wisdom, with old age, with all that life experience. And I found this reference so good because it does apply to the relationship between Lyotard and the students that he's giving the lectures to. They're there listening to him. They also want, like Alcibiades, they are, if they're interested in philosophy, if they want to learn, they are trading their youth, their energy, their hope with Lyotard, who is fulfilling the role of Socrates in that scene. Page 21, quote, desire is that force that holds presence and absence together without mixing them up. End quote. Holding presence and absence together without mixing them up. And this involves recognizing a loss of unity, a lack of completion, or maybe a separation that we get into in the next passages that I'm going to read. This separation reflecting the interplay between presence and absence. Quote from page 58. If the unities of which Hegel and Heraclitus both speak were something that had died completely, so Hegel and Heraclitus talk about the loss of unities, the emergence of separations. But Lyotard says if these unities, separations were complete, if the unities had completely died, we would not be able to sense their lack. Our desire for them today wouldn't be there, and we would not be able to speak of them. Reading this first two chapters, these first two lectures especially, was really interesting because it made me think about how any major philosophical project, any philosophical project, with respect to them, you can ask what disunity, what lost unity is it that is giving rise to them, that they're concerned with. So, for example, for Descartes, you can reformulate the Cartesian project in terms of disunity, the disunity of the world of the mind, the spiritual world on the one hand, on the other hand, the world of the physical bodies, the world of the physical sciences. Of course, there's a connection. We want to also recognize that there's a connection between them, but there's a disunity that Descartes is responding to. For Plato, we can say one of his concerns was the disunity between the world of appearances and reality. For Nietzsche, at least initially, with the birth of tragedy, the disunity between the culture of life-affirming tendencies, life-affirming values, and on the other hand, the culture of life-denying values, life-controlling values, like a cold, calculative academics. Excuse me. With Kant, my last example, we have this unity between two dichotomies, the analytic-synthetic dichotomy on the one hand, and a priori, a posteriori dichotomy. And he plays with that disunity and kind of tries to connect them with the synthetic a priori. Anyways, I'm saying this is just one way to think about a philosophical path in terms of what is lost. And if you have a philosophical interest, maybe you can try to formulate your philosophical interest in terms of what loss of unity that you are responding to. Also reminded of this essay by Umberto Eco that's concerned with loss of unities. It's called The Beauty of the Flame. Talking about, among other things, he's talking about how with fire, our relationship with fire, that used to be about light and warmth, that combination of features that we had with fire are separated from each other. Now we get light from one source, we get heat from a different source. And for me, as a person who was in cognitive science experimental psychology, my philosophical interests began with the recognition of the disunity between behavior and performance. And that's maybe my first contribution that could be described also as philosophical, as concerned with philosophical themes. Anyways, I'm now reading from Lyotard, page 60. What concerns us is less the birth of philosophy than the death of something, a death that has a close link with this birth, end quote. And one possible death or separation is a separation of speech and meaning. Speech is supposed to convey a meaning, but not necessarily so. For example, if you keep repeating a phrase, or if you intentionally want to say nonsensical things, or as Wittgenstein talked about, if language is misunderstood and mishandled and you express something thinking that you're expressing a meaning, but you're not, according to Wittgenstein. Let's read from page 73. Lyotard says, quote, "The everyday experience of finding that we lack the words to say what we want to say does not at all mean that our thought is already there, armed to the teeth, and that the words to transmit it outside have failed to turn up." So he's saying that it doesn't mean that when I think I'm trying to express something that I have the thought, I just don't have the words yet. That my thoughts are ready, just need the words to get them out. That's not the case. That's not true. Again, 73, quote, "When we cannot find our words, this is not because these words are failing our thought, but rather our thought is failing to respond to what is beckoning to it," end quote. Lyotard says it is our thought that is failing to respond. From page 75, quote, "There is most certainly a meaning that exists ahead of our words, pulling them towards it. But until the military front of the words, so to speak, has contacted it, until this meaning has found shelter in their cohort, it will remain muddled, inaudible, as if inexistent," end quote. Jumping to the next page, page 76, quote, "Speaking is this coming and going, this connaissance of discourse and meaning. Otherwise, what we have is ready-made language, the dead letter, as in, 'Hello, how are you?' that speaks in order to say nothing," end quote. So pointing out that small talk, conventional speech, isn't really saying anything. It's just nodding to the existing order and existing convention, just keeping the things as they are. Jumping to page 97, quote, "Philosophical speech explicitly aims at truth but misses it, and yet only insofar as philosophy is at the side of what it says, that it speaks in an aside, is it true," end quote. Here, I also want to read that philosophy is at the side of what it says. I want to read it as philosophy is on the side of what it says. Philosophy is taking side with something. It's taking side with the truth. And as long as you're taking side with the truth, even if you fail to express what you're trying to express, even if your expression is incomplete and inadequate for the time being, it has some truth in it. Lyotard has this chapter called "Taking Side with the Figural," from Discourse Figure. Moving to lecture 4. I'm reading now from page 103. Quote, "In Marxism, there is an apparently decisive radical critique of philosophy. And the radical character of this critique results precisely from the fact that Marx gives philosophy its full depth, takes it completely seriously, and does not simply content himself with dismissing it for its verbal incontinence," end quote. From the same page, quote, "Not only does Marx show that philosophy is a reflection separate from reality, that it has a spiritual existence cut off from existence to court. But he also shows that this separate or separated reflection is unconsciously haunted by reality, by the lives and problems of real people, by the real social problematic. 2 pages later, 105, quote, if a real desire cannot manifest itself in person, or in other words, does not have the power to organize men and things in accordance with itself, then this current tells its story differently, disguises itself, plays the game of power in another sphere of reality, and then we have ideology. We have philosophy, end quote. We have philosophy in the sense that Marx is criticizing philosophy as out of touch with its original motivation. From page 106, quote, philosophy is false insofar as it shifts to another world, the metaphysical world, sublimating, as Freud would put it, what belongs to this world and to this world alone, end quote. So philosophy goes wrong when it claims for itself the things that belong to this world, the world of actual people and actual problems. Jumping back to page 104, in connection to Hegel, quote, Marx did not forget that the content of a false position is not false in itself, but only if it's isolated, taken as absolute. If, rather, it is gathered together with that from which it has been separated, this content appears as a moment, an element of truth in its march. An element of truth in its march, end quote. Page 107. The reality of philosophy results solely from the unreality of reality, the incompleteness of reality, so to speak. It results from the lack experienced in reality. It springs from the way that desire for something else, for another organization of the relations between human beings, a desire that is at work in society, does not manage to free itself from the old social forms. End quote. Remember that reference to small talk? These people say things, but they're not actually saying anything meaningful. They're not expressing any truth. Is returning to similar theme here on page 110. Quote, there are false activities, those that have a superficial appearance of effectiveness, obtaining as they do an immediate result, but that do not really transform things. A politician in the current sense of the term, a leader in the current sense, who has a diary filled with meetings, who has 4 telephones on his desk and dictates 3 letters simultaneously, who with his eloquence can bring packed auditoria to their feet, who has 20,000 people at his beck and call, isn't necessarily someone who transforms reality. End quote. Next page, 111. Quote, transforming the world doesn't mean doing just anything. If the world needs to be transformed, this is because it contains within itself the aspiration to something else. What it lacks is already there. Its own absence from itself is present. If the world needs to be transformed, this is because it is already transformed or wants to be transforming. There is in the present something that announces, anticipates, and beckons the future. End quote. That's why in the beginning of my video on events, phenomenological psychology, I said, if you want to transform even a scientific discipline, like scientific psychology, you can't just do it from the outside. You can't just come up with a formula how science should be done and then impose it on psychology. You should look at psychology instead and see the inconsistencies and contradictions within philosophy, the difference between the voices within psychology already wanting to transform it, already announcing, anticipating, and beckoning a different future. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. I'll speak with you soon. Bye for now.